All right, let's get right into it. We are about to break down one of the most mind-blowing stories in all of economic history. We're talking about how Britain managed to extract what economists now calculate to be $45 trillion from India. But here's the twist. This isn't some simple story about looting and pirates. This is the story of a brilliant, sophisticated financial system that built an entire empire by moving a fortune without ever having to ship a single bar of gold.
To really get the scale of what happened, you just have to look at this chart. In the year 1700, before British rule really took hold, India was an absolute economic powerhouse. It was producing nearly a quarter of everything made in the entire world. But look at the other side. By 1947, when the British left, that number had collapsed to a tiny 3%. This wasn't some accident of history. This was a systematic takedown.
And this is the number at the very heart of it all, $45 trillion. This figure comes from the meticulous research of economist Utsa Patnaik, and just so we can try to wrap our heads around how huge that is, it's about 17 times the entire GDP of the United Kingdom today. It's a number so big it almost doesn't feel real.
So that brings us to the big mystery, right? How on earth did they pull this off? You have to forget everything you think you know about empires stealing treasure. The real story is so much smarter, so much more subtle. It was a heist, but a heist carried out with accounting ledgers and legal documents, hidden in plain sight.
So let's set the stage, because to really understand what was taken, you first have to understand what was there to begin with. We need to get a clear picture of India before it was colonized.
In the early 1700s, India wasn't a developing nation. It was pretty much the industrial workshop of the planet. It was making over a quarter of all the world's manufactured goods. Its textiles, we're talking cottons, silks, muslins, were famous everywhere. The quality was so high that they just completely dominated the global market. It was a rich, prosperous, and thriving economy.
The whole thing started to change with a private company that had its own army, the East India Company. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 was a huge military victory for them. But the real game changer, the economic takeover, happened in 1765 when the company got what was called the Diwani, the right to collect taxes in Bengal, the richest province. And that, right there, is the key. A trading company was now the tax collector. That changed everything. By 1858, things had gotten so out of hand that the British Crown stepped in and took direct control, starting the British Raj.
Okay, so how did a company, and then a whole empire, actually pull off this insane transfer of wealth? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was a series of clever interlocking systems. We're going to break down the three main mechanisms they used.
The first mechanism was just pure simple genius. Here's how it worked. The East India Company would go around collecting taxes from Indian farmers and weavers. Then, they would take a big chunk of that very same money and use it to buy the goods that those same people had produced. Then they'd ship those goods to Britain and sell them for a massive profit. So think about it. The Indians were literally paying the British to take their own stuff. Britain was getting a huge amount of Indian goods year after year for free.
Now, this wasn't just a financial crime. It had a human cost that is almost impossible to comprehend. This number, 60 to 85 million. That's the estimated number of people who died in famines under British rule. And we have to be crystal clear here. The sources are adamant that these were not just droughts or natural disasters. They were catastrophes made infinitely worse by deliberate colonial policy.
Under British rule, India went through 31 major famines. For comparison, in the 2,000 years before British rule, there were only 17. Farmers were often forced to grow cash crops like opium or indigo for export, instead of the food their own families needed to survive. And here's the most shocking part. Records show that even while millions of people were starving to death, Britain kept exporting grain out of those exact same regions. The Bengal famine of 1943, which killed up to 3 million people, actually happened during a year with plenty of rain. It was a man-made disaster, plain and simple.
Okay, this brings us to the most complex but also the most brilliant piece of the whole puzzle. It's a special kind of paper money called council bills. You couldn't use these to buy a loaf of bread in London or Delhi. Nope. They were a unique financial tool designed for one thing and one thing only, controlling India's international trade.
Let's walk through this slowly, because it's a bit of a magic trick. Imagine you're a merchant in New York, and you want to buy some amazing Indian textiles. You couldn't just send gold to the Indian seller. No way. First, you had to send your gold to London to buy these special council bills. That gold then sat in the Bank of England. You'd use the council bills to pay the Indian exporter. The exporter in India would then take these pieces of paper to the local colonial office and trade them for rupees. Rupees which, you guessed it, came from the Indian taxes. So what's the end result? The gold and silver, the actual hard currency from India's exports, never even made it to India. It was all intercepted and captured in London. It's absolutely genius and absolutely devastating.
So that $45 trillion figure is already staggering. But what happens when you think about not just the money that was taken, but the growth that was lost? What happens when you factor in the power of compound interest over 2 centuries? Well, that's when the true cost becomes almost beyond belief. If you take that $45 trillion and you let it grow at a really conservative 5% interest rate, the value today skyrockets to over $200 trillion. And that number represents so much more than just money. It's the lost potential. It's the schools, the hospitals, the industries, the entire future that could have been built with that wealth. This chart really puts it into a brutal perspective. That lost fortune is more than 7 times the entire economy of the United States today. And it's over 50 times the size of India's current GDP. It's an economic hole so vast it's hard to even imagine.
Now, in other parts of the world, when historical wrongs have been committed, there's a precedent for paying reparations. Germany has paid over 70 billion euros to Holocaust survivors. Japan paid South Korea. But when it comes to what might be the largest economic extraction in history, Britain has paid a grand total of 0.
Now, obviously, nobody thinks it's possible to actually repay trillions of dollars. It's not about the money. That's why many people, like the Indian politician Shashi Tharoor, have suggested something symbolic. His idea? Britain should pay just £1 a year for 200 years. It's not compensation. It's an admission, a moral acknowledgement that a debt is owed.
Okay, but what about the other side of the argument? You'll always hear this, right? The idea that Britain left behind gifts, things like the railways, democracy, and education. Well, let's take a hard look at the data and see if those arguments actually hold up. First up, the railways. They were not a gift, they were built for Britain's benefit, period. Their main purpose was to move troops around to control the population and to get raw materials like cotton from the inside of the country to the ports so they could be shipped to Britain. And the best part? Indian taxpayers paid for the entire thing. In fact, British investors were guaranteed a huge return on their investment, paid for by India no matter what. And education? This one is a shocker. Before colonialism, India had a really robust network of indigenous schools. But after almost 200 years of British civilizing influence, the literacy rate at independence was a pathetic 12%. They didn't build an education system, they systematically dismantled the one that was already there.
And you don't even have to take my word for it. Let's look at the architect of British education in India, Thomas Macaulay, in his own words. The goal wasn't to educate the masses. The goal, as he says right here, was to create a very specific class of people, Indians, who would be English in every way except for the color of their skin. They needed them to be clerks and low-level administrators to help run the empire for them.
So when you put all of this together, it's clear that this is so much more than just a story from a history book. It's an unsettled debt, and its consequences are still being felt all around the world today.
And you know, that fundamental pattern of wealth extraction, it didn't just disappear in 1947. Many economists and critics argue it just changed its form. They say you can see echoes of it today in things like IMF loan conditions that enforce austerity, or in the way dominant currencies give some countries huge economic power over others. The tools are different, but the basic imbalance of power can still look very familiar.
And so, I want to leave you with this one final question to think about. Just imagine, what could have been? What if that unimaginable sum of wealth had been reinvested in India's own development? What if its world-class industries had never been destroyed? What would a country that was responsible for a quarter of the world's economy in 1700 have become? It's a question that really changes how you look at the world we live in today.